Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take that stack of sources you've given us, could be articles, research, notes, anything really, and we pull out the most important insights.
Yeah, think of it as your shortcut to getting up to speed. We try to find the surprising bits, maybe add a little context.
Keep things interesting. And for this deep dive, we're tackling a big one. Perceived marriage crises around the world. We're using this collection of global perspectives you sent over.
Right. And our mission, let's say, is to understand what these moments of marriage crisis really tell us. Because, it's rarely just about relationships ending, is it?
No, it seems much bigger, like a window into societal anxieties, state worries, how lives are fundamentally changing in different places, different times.
Exactly. And the sources, well, they hint at some pretty surprising things right off the bat. Maybe what looks like a crisis isn't quite what it seems.
Or that governments have had, really old reasons for being interested in who marries whom, deeply embedded reasons. Let's get into it.
Okay, so the central idea weaving through these sources is that when people start talking about a marriage crisis, it's usually a signpost for something else, something broader.
Right, not just about, unhappy couples. It becomes a vehicle almost for debating big economic changes or political shifts or pushing certain policies.
Yeah, or even tackling what society sees as social problems.
Yeah.
Looking at why people are saying marriage is in crisis tells you a lot about the background forces.
And a huge player here, the source's stress, is the state, governments.
Absolutely. Historically, the modern state has been incredibly invested in, well, promoting and regulating certain kinds of marriage, specific family structures.
There's this concept mentioned, the nationalization of the family.
Precisely. And thinkers like Foucault pointed out this interesting paradox. Public talk tried to make the family seem totally private, right?
Yeah, your own business.
But at the same time, states made sure families served public goals, national objectives. Regulating intimate stuff like marriage was actually key to building nations, governing people.
And not just way back in 19th century Europe either. It seems this was broader.
Oh, much broader. And it continued. The basic assumption often was, and maybe still is, that a certain kind of marriage is fundamental for citizens to thrive. Legally, socially.
Like a building block for the whole nation.
Exactly. So if that block seems shaky, maybe marriage rates fall, divorce goes up, people opt out, it gets framed as a crisis.
Yeah.
Not just for the people involved, but for the nation.
Wow. Okay. And gender roles are right in the middle of all this.
Completely central. The sources really hammer this home. Marriage is this powerful lens for looking at gender itself, how society expects men and women to act, to contribute.
You think about someone like Nancy F. Cott, how defining husband and wife roles was so critical for identity, even national identity.
Right, and historically, a wife's obligations, her relationship to the state, could be totally different from her husband's. Citizenship itself could be tied to marriage for women not that long ago in many places.
So this whole crisis thing happens in that messy space, sort of between the supposedly private family and the state's public interest.
That's the tension point. And because marriage sits right there, any perceived shift, any crossing of that line can provoke really strong reactions from governments, from the public.
Let's make this concrete. Late imperial Russia, that's one example in the sources. The talk of marriage crisis there seems linked to massive changes after serfdom ended in 1861, the Great Reforms.
Yeah, a period of huge upheaval. You had more social mobility, this growing idea of individualism, markets expanding, new ideas spreading through books, romantic novels.
All bumping up against the old ways of doing things, including marriage.
Definitely. And we see real evidence of this pushback. The sources talk about tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of wives petitioning the Tsar between the 1880s and 1914.
Petitioning for what?
Relief, basically. Relief from patriarchal family laws they found oppressive. And this wasn't just a trickle, it was a huge increase compared to earlier decades, mostly from women in cities, working or middle class.
That's incredible. And you saw it in culture, too.
Oh, yeah. Famous novels like Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done kicked off with the heroine refusing a forced marriage. A big critic at the time even compared forced marriage for noble women to actual serfdom.
So this idea of involuntary marriage, marrying without love or choice, it wasn't just sad, it was seen as doomed.
Increasingly so. Maybe not the only reason marriages failed, but a big contributing factor. It highlights this growing demand, especially from women, for emotional connection, for affection, within marriage itself. Okay, now let's jump across the world. Turn of the century, Rio de Janeiro. Different context, similar anxieties.
Brazil, right after slavery abolition in 1888, and the
Huh.
Republic formed in 89. Big changes.
Huge. And the elites there were worried about Brazil's image internationally. Low marriage rates, lots of children born outside marriage. It looked uncivilized to them.
So the state gets more involved again.
Exactly. Promoting specific marriage norms, pushing civil ceremonies over church ones, shifting power there, using the new penal code to enforce family stability.
And aimed at women specifically.
Often, yes.
Hmm.
The message was kind of, marriage and domestic life are your path to being a proper citizen. Meanwhile, Rio's exploding in population, doubling in under 20 years. Immigration, urbanization, lots of strain.
And legal debates, too, about women's status.
Right. When they were writing the Civil Code, there were big arguments. Are women active legal subjects or sort of passive ones?
And this tied into ideas about race, the Brazilian race.
Yes. Managing families was seen as linked to, well, improving the nation's stock. It fed into policies encouraging European immigration, even massive slum clearance projects, tearing down tenement housing associated with the poor, the recently free, the supposedly immoral.
So the fear was that a marriage crisis was just a symptom of something deeper threatening the nation.
Pretty much a symptom of underlying immorality. And there was this very specific fear about households run by women, often portrayed negatively, leading to social problems, prostitution, that kind of thing.
Okay, fast forward to the 1920s U.S., the Jazz Age, another perceived crisis, right?
Yeah.
This time driven by changing morals, sex.
Yeah, changing sexual attitudes, more access to contraception, easier divorce. This is where the idea of modern marriage really comes into focus.
The revolution in manners and morals. Flappers, smoking, dancing.
Petting, drinking during Prohibition. Yeah. Sex outside marriage became more common, even within the same social groups. Cities, cars, speakeasies where men and women mixed. It all fed into it.
And contraception was becoming more available.
Definitely. Partly boosted by WWI, concerns about STDs among soldiers. Condoms got marketed more openly as prophylactics.
Yeah.
And you saw commercial feminine hygiene products emerge, basically allowing women to separate sex and having babies more easily.
And the illegal abortion. The sources say it was quite common, an open secret.
Remarkably so, apparently. Accepted discreetly, even with harsh laws. One source notes this weird contrast. Strict laws, but public opinion often saw it as necessary evil, especially for unmarried women.
So marriage itself starts to look different. Modern marriage versus the Victorian idea.
Right. Birth control exists, premarital sex happens, maybe monogamy isn't always strictly followed, and sex itself becomes central. A key way to show love. Mutual satisfaction for both partners was suddenly important, a measure of the marriage's success.
Though the housework division stayed pretty traditional.
Largely, yes. And there was a bit of a conservative swing after the 1929 crash. Some feminists even pulled back on advocating for wives' economic independence for a while.
But not everyone was thrilled with this modern view. There were critics.
Oh, yes. Joseph Woodcrutch argued that if love just becomes about individual sexual satisfaction, it loses its deeper meaning, its transcendental implications. He thought society was kind of left adrift, chasing love but finding it empty. Okay, another jump. Post-war France. Now the idea is about finding that grand amour, that great love, inside marriage.
A shift from earlier times when maybe love was expected outside of practical marriage.
Exactly. Young couples, even facing tough times after the war, really prioritized personal happiness fulfillment within their marriage.
But did that create new anxieties? Like, if happiness is the main goal, what happens when you're not happy?
That was the worry. Commentators feared these marriages would be unstable, easily broken. They pointed to links between rising divorce and things like juvenile delinquency.
And gender roles. Talk of equality, but reality.
Reality lagged behind. Studies showed women still did almost all the housework and childcare. This ideal of equality in difference bumped up against stubborn norms.
What about premarital sex in post-war France?
Widespread assumption it was increasing, especially for women. But surveys showed a funny thing. People believed it was happening more, but they still strongly disapproved, again, especially for women. Virginity was still seen as important for a stable marriage later on.
And it did happen.
Oh, it happened. Often with the person they planned to marry, sometimes seen as a way of, like, sealing the deal before the official ceremony.
So even with talk of satisfaction, the main concern was still stability.
Stability remained paramount. Advice often focused on wives keeping husbands happy sexually to avoid infidelity. The focus was very much on holding the marriage together.
Okay, let's pivot to how this looks in colonial contexts, sometimes leading into more recent times. Colonial India, that 1929 Child Marriage Restraint Act again. raising the marriage age.
Right. For some Indian nationalists, this was presented as progress, modernizing India, showing they could reform their own society.
But not everyone saw it that way.
No, particularly Muslim groups. They viewed it as the colonial state interfering in religious law, in custom, an attack on Muslim identity, actually, a way of making them a minority within the legal framework of the emerging nation.
So marriage reform gets tangled up with nationalism.
Deeply. And critiques of the law, like from the Muslim community, could just be brushed off as religious backlash. But the sources argue it was more than that. It was an alternative vision for the nation, a critique of how state processes were marginalizing them. Then you look at colonial Burma. Similar dynamic. Marriage gets tied to this emerging idea of Burmese national identity, homogeneity, meaning the Burmese race, Buddhist religion.
Exactly. And fear of mixed marriage, especially Indo-Burmese marriage, was seen as a threat to that.
And women's roles again?
Part of the anxiety, yes. Women were becoming more public. Nationalist women's groups worried about Buddhist women losing rights if they married outside the faith. The press really targeted women, protect the race, protect the religion, marry Burmese Buddhist men. And colonial Zanzibar. Early 20th century, another complex situation, post-slavery changes, plus the British system kind of hardening ethnic divisions, Arab versus non-Arab, marriage becomes a flashpoint.
What kinds of issues? Men complaining about high dowries demanded by elders. Women wanting more say. Child marriage young girls, older men became a fight between elders and colonial officials who were officially against it. Marriage was still key to adulthood, but it reflected all these power struggles. And concepts like kapha suitability in marriage reinforced divisions, like Arab women not marrying Swahili men. Generally, yes, though it happened more after abolition. You saw debates in newspapers who's a better spouse. Women started pushing boundaries in the 40s and 50s, seeking education, work, coming out of seclusion more.
Even elite women.
Even elite Arab women challenged norms around purity. There's a case mentioned of a widow who was a nurse, facing pressure to stay secluded but wanting to continue her career. Shows the tension. And again, colonial officials were often hesitant to crack down on child marriage, despite the laws.
Okay, bringing it really up to date. Contemporary China, the state's been involved in marriage for ages, right? Socialist values, later reforms on divorce, property.
Long history of regulation. But the sources looking at today, they point to this huge gap between the law on the books and what actually happens. The state isn't monolithic. Implementation varies wildly.
And rural women often get the short end of the stick.
That's the argument. Because of deep-rooted traditions, patrilineal inheritance, couples living with the husband's family women often end up as outsiders in their married communities with weak claims to property, even when the law says otherwise.
So state reforms have limits against local traditions.
Significant limits, it seems. It really highlights that disconnect.
Okay.
Japan. Perception of families in crisis divorce, low birth rate, poverty, a big gap between the iconic stable family image and reality.
And the state relies heavily on families for welfare.
Massively. The system has encouraged families to care for elders, the poor, disabled, less emphasis on state institutions or pensions compared to many Western countries.
Which puts huge pressure on families, especially with ongoing gender inequality.
Exactly. The wage gap, women in precarious jobs, and women still doing almost all the housework and childcare. It's a heavy load.
And this affects marriage choices, people delaying or not marrying.
It contributes, yes.
Yeah.
Economic insecurity is part of it. But also, for women especially, the perceived benefits of marriage seem lower now. The costs, personal, financial, career-wise, look high. The gains may be less certain. Remember the parasite singles debate? That ties into these economic pressures passed down to generations.
Media plays a role too, highlighting problems.
Yeah, making issues like domestic violence, child abuse more visible, partly due to better reporting and reforms, not just rising rates. This puts pressure back on the government.
What about contemporary Iran? The sources argue it's not just economics driving the perceived crisis there.
Right. The argument presented is that it's more about the gendered legacy of the '79 revolution and the Iraq War. The state promoted a very specific idea of manhood.
Well,
Soldier, martyr, husband, father.
and Iranian cinema reflects struggles with this.
Interestingly, yes. Even under state oversight, films apparently explore the difficulties men face living up to these ideals. Marriage and men's ability to be the provider-protector within it is a huge preoccupation.
So it's framed as a potential masculinity crisis, when men can't achieve that state-approved role.
That's the interpretation offered. When the institutional basis, patriarchal marriage, maybe a military role aren't accessible. Marriage is portrayed as almost compulsory. Tragedy follows if men can't attain it.
And things like temporary marriage returning. That's linked.
Possibly. A way for the state, perhaps, to offer some option when the ideal isn't achievable for many disadvantaged men. It seems the cultural power of marriage is harder to change than just altering laws.
Okay, finally, contemporary Egypt. The common story is economics again, right? High costs, unemployment, stopping young people getting married.
That's the dominant narrative in media and public discussion. Marriage is seen as vital for independence, for having sex legitimately.
But the sources here push back on that.
They do. They argue that changes aren't really crisis proportions. Yes, people marry later, but it's comparable to similar countries. And crucially, never marriage isn't common for women.
And the cost thing, it's not accurate.
Well, the data presented suggests costs actually peaked in the 80s and have declined since the late 90s, which is pretty counterintuitive to the public narrative.
So if it's not just economics, what's driving the anxiety about delayed marriage, especially for men?
The argument links it to wider fears. Fears about unmarried young men being idle, maybe prone to deviance, or even political unrest. There's a hint of the post-9/11 war on terror context, too, associating unemployed single Muslim men with potential trouble.
Interesting. So the suggestion is focus on opportunities, not just blame.
Basically, yeah. Instead of just blaming young men or the economy, maybe focus on giving them productive outlets for their energy. So if we try to pull these threads together, what do we see? These perceived marriage crises, they're never just one thing, are they?
No, they're all tangled up with how nations see themselves, what states want, economic pressures, shifting expectations between people, and always gender roles across time, across the globe.
Right. These deep dives really show how choices that feel intensely private, who you marry, if you marry, become incredibly public, incredibly political. They act like barometers for societal anxieties.
Yeah, reflecting how society views its own stability, its future.
Which leaves us with a question maybe for you listening. How do these stories from other times and places shed light on the debates about marriage in your own society today?
How does that state interest, that public dimension we talked about, still shape what we think of as purely personal choices? Something to mull over. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into marriage crises. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, hope it gave you some food for thought, lots to explore there.
Until next time.